As someone who's been using acrylic paint for many years, what I've really been enthusiastic about is the fact that over those years, there have been there's been a real expansion of the kinds of qualities and surfaces you can get with that with that medium. With the acrylic paints, you have additives, gel mediums, and glazing mediums that give you, when added to the paint itself, the color itself, you end up with extremely different sorts of expressive physical surfaces. This is a kind of police lineup of various kinds of additives and various kinds of materials you're going to be mixing with your paints to get different sorts of physical textures. The one off to the left is simply my version of a spray bottle, a very small mister, pump spray, which you've used with your acrylics to make them more workable, and to keep them workable even on your palette and on the surface of the canvas. The next low jar there with the red stripe is your heavy gel medium. This was part of the Painting One kit, and was used for both glazing and textures. The next one, the glazing medium, which is another additive that is much more liquid, much more drippy and puddly. You mix a lot of that with the paint, and you end up with things that become very much like a Jackson Pollock drip, but with a kind of translucency, a kind of transparency that we'll see later. The last one is a very specialized additive. It's a kind of gritty pumice gel, which gives you, when you mix with paint, it gives you a kind of sandpaper coarseness. This is coarse pumice gel. Now, except for the heavy gel medium, these other things would have to be purchased. So here's a lineup of tools used with the application and manipulation of all these mediums. The um, the spray bottle itself is a kind of mister, one where you fill it with water and you mist gently the canvas itself, and also especially the palette, and because acrylics set up and dry relatively quickly, this keeps them more workable, through a longer period of time. The next is very straightforward and obvious brush, not only used for the traditional sorts of laying into paint, but especially with the scumbling, with the kind of dry brush effort, with larger brushes especially, you can hit the peaks of textures, you can hit rough textures underneath with another color, and drag a kind of speckled textured color on top of another color. And with, I just threw in the plastic fork there, because it sort of symbolizes all the many ad hoc instruments, things you can use to scratch, to pull, to sort of manipulate and agitate on that surface of canvas. I've used the fork in my demonstration for a kind of scratching through and a kind of efficient multi-lined drawing on a area of color that has another color underneath, which obviously when you scratch it comes up as a kind of line drawing. And obviously your palette knife, which is used to mix the paint, as well as with the heavy gel medium itself. You can agitate it, push it, slather it, and build up physical textures that are very thick. This is indeed a test strip that I've laid down, a test strip of opaque yellow, on which I will place the various mediums and glazes. So what we'll do next is to take the heavy gel medium and mix a color with it, lots more proportional gel than color itself. And because it's the heavy gel medium, if you want to get a glaze with that, you really have to work it in. It's got its own texture, it's got its own thickness, and therefore pressing, brushing, working it into that surface of opaque color will give you something of a glaze. Next we are trying scrafito, scratching through of a layer of color. And for that I've mixed an opaque reddish color, cadmium red plus a little bit of terra rosa. I wanted a contrast, a dark contrast, value contrast, and hue contrast with the yellow below it. And again, you would have to work this when it is somewhat wet. You don't let it dry to scratch through. You obviously attack it when it's somewhat wet. So I'm going to finish this off as a shape and make sure it's opaque and covering up the yellow. There's no yellow coming through now, but with a kind of scratching through it, this time the palette knife. You see lines in there, and this is where you can really get individually creative. Any kind of tool, any kind of hardware, kitchen nail tool, or sharp point, or even semi-dull point will allow you to get different quality lines. So you're essentially drawing through. Here I have a plastic fork, which will give me a kind of efficient multi set of parallel lines, curvy or not, through the layer of paint. What's important to do with the glazes, whatever medium you're using, is to experiment. There's no cookbook recipe for each and every color. Each has a different amount of pigment and a different kind of vehicle and medium. And I've chosen here a kind of dark dioxidine purple, which will be mixed with the gel medium, the heavy gel medium. I'm going to make a glaze, strangely enough, with the gel medium. But I want to show you by smearing things around how different transparencies you can get, how dense, how translucent you can get with different proportions of the medium. So I'm going to take this purple, which is very dark and doesn't really begin to read as a color sometimes unless you begin to mix it with white or have a white ground underneath that's sort of adding white to its value. And I will add more and more and more until I get the kind of translucency, the kind of transparency I'm after. So I scrape it on the palette now, and I can get some idea before you put it on the canvas itself. You get some idea of how see-through, how translucent it might be. I'm going to try for more of the gel medium into this amount of purple, and scrape it, smear it across the palette to see if that should indeed make it more translucent and lighter in value. Now, when I get the degree of translucency I want, I'll put it in, and because I've chosen a purple to go over this yellow, this is how you can control color itself by doing glazes. The yellow itself is a bright, intense primary color, and we all know from grade school art that purple is the complement of yellow, and therefore when they are optically mixed together, when you're sort of physically scrubbing one on top of another, or with a true glazing medium, pouring it and brushing it in a more liquid way on top of the other, you end up essentially mixing color by layering color. You're affecting color by not necessarily mixing it all on the palette, but by mixing it optically on the surface of the canvas. I'm next going to apply a layer of thicker paint, and that thickness is arrived at by adding a lot of gel medium, the heavy gel medium. I had used it before as a kind of ad hoc glazing medium by pressing it in, but this is the way it's meant to be used, in that it becomes a very physical, stable, manipulable surface in terms of peaks and valleys. So I'm going to do a layer here that really becomes a kind of preparation layer for what's called dry brush, okay, scumbling. In other words, we're going to lay down a kind of preliminary layer that is a mountain range of peaks and valleys, on which will, when it's dry, you will you'll add paint, you'll scrape paint either with brush or palette knife or both, so that there's a kind of textural, natural, organic accident that happens with one layer of paint being speckled and textured by another layer of paint. With this agitation of the paint, you can think of the things you might do in real life, things that would be instances where texture would be applied to decoration, to different materials. You can think of interior rooms that have a kind of faux stucco plaster on the wall. You can think of cement that can be agitated into a kind of texture. There are decorative qualities that you could relate to in the real world. Here we're trying to do something artistic. Here we're trying to build a set of peaks and valleys that you have to sort of project and imagine as, that's not an earthquake, that's just the table shaking. Peaks and valleys that would sort of gather and catch a raking brush or palette knife over them. So while you can't guarantee, in fact it's going to be an accident entirely, you can't guarantee what's going to happen. Think about how the physical process of raking an amount of paint on these physical textures is going to somehow result in a complicated combination of color. Now the important thing to remember about this is that that layer on which you're dry brushing color has to dry. It depends on the thickness of your paint, but an hour or overnight or however long it takes, just feel it that it's extremely rigid and hard when you're adding the dry brush. So I'm mixing a color here, which is at this point kind of arbitrary, but I'm thinking about what kind of contrast might happen with that color below, and those contrasts can be subtle. Those contrasts can be extreme and deep and strong. I've got a kind of hue contrast with the red and a value contrast with the darkness of this red. It's also rather intense in terms of a color versus the earth color, that yellow ochre that is underneath. So I'm mixing up, at this point, not much gel, if any gel, no gel medium. I'm just using a color. And I'm using this relatively small brush to hit this this narrow ridge of texture. But you can also use, obviously, larger brushes, and if you continue with this kind of activity, a fan brush. A fan brush is sort of the standard tool that you would use, because it's exactly what it sounds like. Its bristles are spread out, and you can sort of daub paint across a wider area. So especially if you have a wider area of textures that you want to scumble, you need a bigger brush, if not a fan brush. So depending on the complexity of your textures, the strength and high and low mountain range of your textures, you could mix other colors, especially over vast expanses of textures, and use the large brush, adding other colors to the scumbling, so it becomes even more complicated, not just one color above another. It's important to have some idea as to what happens with the traditional glazing medium. This is a satin glazing medium, much more liquid than the gel medium, and I'm adding it to this red paint that we'd previously mixed, just to give you an idea as to the difference between opaque, thick gel medium, heavy gel medium versus the glazing medium. The glazing medium, as I've said, is a kind of liquid, drippy, very very runny sort of material, and I'm mixing it here more and more and more and more with the red, so that I can get from that rather opaque and thick layering up top with the scumbling to a more translucent transition into, or at least showing through, the yellow underneath. And I'm just going to keep adding things and experimenting. This is where especially with abstract expressionism, all kinds of paintings, but especially with abstract expressionism, you keep in mind that that you indeed mix a lot on the canvas. That it's very often an attack and manipulation right on the canvas rather than mixing colors full blown and complete on your palette. So it's important, as you'll see in a sec, that the glazed medium can be mixed sometimes directly onto the canvas itself. So think of an abstract expressionist canvas as also a palette that you're scraping, that you're mixing, that you're allowing the accident of your movement of the brush to become a quality that's expressive on the canvas itself. And at this point, I can't really say that I have a preconception of what's going to happen. I'm just going to play, seriously play, with the amount of gel medium versus the color, and to see what happens when that glaze is put on top of the yellow. And of course, as I've said previously, you can obviously mix right on the canvas itself. And what I'm doing is dripping, adding directly the glazing medium to the color and dragging it, playing with it, moving it around in a way that gives me not a predetermined kind of quality. Obviously, you can scrape, you can pull, you can use various tools, becoming really a combination of glazing plus, in this case, a kind of broad stroke scrafito. So I just want to see what happens as you mix more and more of the glazing medium right on the canvas, and we're pulling it down into. We're pulling it down into and pressing it into the yellow underneath. And you can see what's happening gradually is a kind of value change, is a kind of darkness to lightness change as we bring it down to the yellow, the underpainting of yellow. And I'm continuing to work here, not knowing what I'm doing in a sense, because I want to react immediately in real time to what's happening. I continue to make a lighter and thinner glaze. I like the idea that there's a kind of value change between the top and the bottom, and I will manipulate that, almost going back to a kind of scrafito, obviously, but this time with the broader stroke of the palette knife. See how I can do more than lines, more like a value band of different color that's been manipulated into this surface. More play, more detail. I like the idea of the rough edge that's against the white canvas. That can happen against other colors. And I'd like it to be even more dense and dark at the top. So I'm going to add a bit more of that opaque red, build it up to make both a physical texture, and because it's so thick, even though it has medium in it, because it's so thick in its application, you end up with a stronger red along that top band. It's a constant activity of just perceiving what's happening on the canvas, and you're reacting, knowledgeably. You know what you're doing with the materials, but at the same time, you've gotten to the point, and with the kind of speed that you're not overthinking or thinking deliberately about what's happening. There's a kind of immediate recognition and intuitive risk-taking about changing things as you're developing them. Again, it's like growing a garden. You're letting things evolve rather than be filled in a kind of predetermined way. A few dots and dashes. Make it more complex. So one of the paradoxes of being a teacher and an artist is that you get to the point, even with this pseudoscientific or teaching demonstration that I'm doing right now, where I just want to let go. I just want to play around with this stack of colors, and I'm also seeing that there's this vast white space around it. And while I don't necessarily want to fill it all up with acrylic, I do want to make this this totem, this sort of this layering of color, be a little more expressive and reach out, almost as if it's breaking its boundaries and becoming something more than just, as I said, a demonstration. So I'm mixing this color here, and I will begin to put it so that it becomes a kind of escape artist, a kind of breaking the boundaries and borders form. I'm into the physical stuff here, and I just want it to sort of dictate to me, or not dictate as much as just invite me to play in a serious way. So I think I'll simply agitate and put things across this zone of neutral purple yellow here, and maybe even let's see what happens. I'll drag it out into the blank canvas off to the side. So there's a kind of asteroid belt of dots and dashes that go across this. More and more. I want that to be a kind of line, a broken line, a kind of natural occurrence of texture outside. And it's also a question of scale. You'll be working on areas that would be moderately bigger than this. I'm sort of restricted to the size of this canvas, and also several demonstrations in one small area. But if you've got canvases that begin to be larger than this, and you begin to use gesture and motion and activity, action painting. Action painting was one of the phrases used for the abstract expressionists. And while I'm being a little didactic and tight here, there's no reason why you can't smear and pull and push. That's actually push and pull is a Hans Hofmann abstract expressionist phrase, over a larger area. With all these materials, these additives to your paint, the gels and the mediums, along with the color, you can think of music. You can think of music as being a kind of metaphor for the kinds of textures, the kinds of emotional impact that these physical qualities have that are similar to an instrumental quality, a saxophone versus a trombone, a cello versus a violin, cymbals versus a piccolo. You've got a whole symphony here that you can get into.